Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Living in the Woods in a Tree, Remembering Blaze Foley by Sybil Rosen. Narrated by Pam Ward. Preface. Half a lifetime ago, I was 25 years old and living in a tree house in rural Georgia with a country musician named Deputy Dog. It was, I would later write, like falling out of a dream. How could I know then where our lives would take us? In the course of our love affair, Deputy Dog would reinvent himself as Blaze Foley, the enigmatic outlaw singer-songwriter whose fatal shooting at the age of 39 would ensure his status as legend. I, too, would become a writer, only to spend the next couple of decades trying to put that time and that man into words, stuffed into plays and shaped into idealized characters. He eluded my attempts to recapture his untamed spirit, as there was always something missing, some misplaced piece of our story I forgot to remember for a very long time. 14 years after his death, I found that piece again, and was compelled to go looking for the reasons why I'd lost so much of the memory of our love. They were harder to face than I could have imagined, and surprisingly easier to find. Blaze had left me clues along the way. Now, sitting down again, this time to tell the unvarnished truth, it too wants to become a story. It's inescapable, I guess. For the truth can be hard to recognize through a 25-year-old lens, translucent with age, veined with tiny fractures. The glass crinkles the borders of distant images, blurring certain moments and crystallizing others. I'm helpless to do anything but describe what I see and feel now, in the hope that these words will convey some of the fleeting sweetness we knew then. Yet, if memory is unreliable, what becomes of the past? Can it only be known through the present? At this moment I am 52, a writer, single and childless. In the 20-odd years since my life with Deputy Dog, I've known pleasure, jealousy, affection, though never again did I expect to find a heart in which my own could make a home. Over time I made up my mind. I would learn to long without suffering. I would make peace with being alone. Secretly, I used to dream that if I reached middle age with love still unmet, some man from my past would come back to claim me. It never occurred to me that he might be dead. Moonlight shining through the trees, moonlight shining down on me, lights the way for lovers in the dark. Moonbeams dance on rain-drenched trees, sparkle for our eyes to see. Moonlight, shine on down and shine on me. Moonlight bathes the woods around, paradise that we have found. Here among the trees and things we love, shines on friends off far away, brings us to another day. Moonlight, shine on down and shine on me. Laying with the one I love, looking at the moon above, being where we really want to be. The autumn winds for now are still. The moon shines on, it always will. Moonlight, shine on down and shine on me. Moonlight Song by Deputy Dog, 1975. Part 1. Moonlight. Chapter 1. Things I can't throw away. The dead have a long reach, and they can be patient. They wait till you are ready, and then they seep back into your heart and crack it open. They pour out of the tissue where you've hidden them away and insist on being known again. Deputy Dog had come back without warning 2 months ago, in early September 2002. In 8 short weeks, I've gone from being a menopausal skeptic about love to a hormone-drenched teenager who believes in ghosts, who waits at night for one to visit her. Where once I prided myself on self-knowledge, a contradiction at best, now I stumble blind through memory and grief, astonished to find myself jealous of rivals I never knew, for the heart of a man who's been dead 13 years. I can hardly remember who I was before. The one thing I'm certain of is that I was already mourning the latest dog in my life, a blonde, sassy lab and Irish setter mix named LaRue. She had been felled by cancer of the snout, cruel karma for a being who always followed her nose. In long rambles through the woods, LaRue had revealed to me events I might not otherwise noticed. Beavers swimming in a moonlit embrace, bear cubs high in the pines. Her sturdy presence had made it possible for me to live on my own for more than a decade and write. Often I'd thought of dedicating every word to her, since she'd given up so many hours when she could have been out rolling on a dead skunk, to snooze beside me on the floor while I sat at my computer, wrestling with the muse. At the end of July I had put her to sleep for the last time, and now my bones still ached for her big-barreled body and undiluted affection, the warp and woof of our life together. LaRue had been gone for 5 weeks when Deputy Dog showed up. First, in the form of a note from an old friend in Georgia whom I hadn't spoken to in years. I didn't hesitate. I was ripe for distraction, and a voice from the past was calling. I emailed him back right away. Hello, hello, hello. Are you still Billy, and do you still have a ponytail down your back? Billy's reply told me that he'd exchanged the ponytail for a beard. He was getting in touch after all these years to inform me of a documentary film about Blaze Foley, who, unbeknownst to me in the years since his death in 1989, had become a posthumous country music legend. Apparently Abraxas Productions, the film company out of Austin, Texas, had been looking for me for a long time. The filmmakers were too young to have known Blaze personally, but drawn to his moving music and tragic fate, not to mention a growing number of fans worldwide, they had started production 6 years ago, with no clue that their roving subject had once been Deputy Dog with a treehouse address. From the very first interview, they kept hearing about some woman Blaze had loved in Georgia, though the only name anyone could come up with then was Little Sybil. Finally, this past summer, they had backtracked him to Whitesburg, the red clay hamlet west of Atlanta where Deputy Dog and I had first met. By the end of filming, Billy wrote me, they were desperate to find you. You were the inspiration for his song, If I Could Only Fly. Is that not true? True or not, Billy had been reticent to tell them our story. After all, no one in Whitesburg had heard from me in years, and maybe that was the way I preferred it. I'd never forgotten the treehouse, but I rarely thought of Deputy Dog apart from it any more. If I did, it was always with the unquestioned assumption that he, like me, had assigned our time a vague negativity and moved on. The last time I'd seen him was in New York City, sometime in the early 80s. I couldn't even tell Billy the year now. Intrigued, I got in touch with the filmmakers. They were willing to come to the Catskill Mountains in eastern New York, where I'd made my home for the past 3 years, if I were willing to talk to them about Blaze or Deputy or both. Somehow it made more sense to meet them halfway in Whitesburg, as so much of my time with Deputy Dog had taken place there. They think I have secrets to tell them. I know I have secrets to learn. Since the arrival of Billy's note, I'd begun to feel like I'd entered a dream I'd been having for years, but couldn't recall until now. I went up to the attic to dig out a box labeled Things I Can't Seem to Throw Away. It's not very big, nor is there very much in it, considering how much I've moved around in the last 25 years, or the volume of clothing, jewelry, furniture, housewares, knickknacks, and whatnots that have passed through my hands so far, all of them weightless, whatever their appearance. Try to grasp them, and they float on through, like items on a spaceship, freed from gravity or meaning, and so are soon forgotten. But some things will not let you forget them. No matter how hard you try to let them go, they insist on sticking around. From the box, I unearthed a stack of yellowing postcards and letters, postmarked 1976 and addressed to Mrs. Little Sybil Rosen Dog Foley of Austin, Texas. How long had it been since I'd thought about our hippie wedding on the back porch of a friend's cabin in Georgia? or the book of Shakespeare Deputy had given me our last Christmas together. Here, too, were drafts of plays I'd begun about him after we parted, both unfinished. Beneath the scripts I found this other Deputy Dog keepsake, housed in the same black paper sack for over 25 years, coiled like an unbroken brushstroke and glossy as the day he gave it to me in Chicago. His ponytail. Online I typed in the words Blaze Foley. To my amazement, there were hundreds of links to his name, websites devoted solely to the fallen legend, replete with photos, song lyrics, accolades, and eulogies, some exalting him as the duct-tape messiah, others as a poetic pain in the ass. His last live performance, recorded a month before his death, as well as 3 tribute albums by fellow Texas musicians, had been released in Austin in the past decade. Tunes had been written about him, too, including the late Townes Van Zant's Blaze's Blues and Lucinda Williams' Drunken Angel. And Van Zant was said to have written Marie, his woeful song about homelessness, with Blaze in mind. This was all news to me. The man pictured on my screen was not the one I'd known. This man was thicker set, weighted by intractable sorrow, aged beyond his years, described as a homeless homebody, champion of the dispossessed, mystical maverick, outcast, hero, addict, saint. None of these exactly contradicted the man I once knew, yet all of them together could not sum him up. Through every mention ran a palpable reverence for his talent as a songwriter. Most of all, he was celebrated for If I Could Only Fly. Willie Nelson and Merle Haggard had recorded the song on a duet album, Seashores of Old Mexico, released in the late 80s. Now I learned that Haggard had re-recorded it over 10 years later on a solo album entitled If I Could Only Fly. He had sung the song at Tammy Wynette's memorial service, broadcast from the Grand Ole Opry on national TV. Until this moment I had no idea of the tune's popularity or reach, though I could still sing every word. I'd first heard them on a blustery March day in Chicago in 1977. Dimly I could see Deputy Dog sitting on the bed in our drab apartment, 27 years old and razor-thin, hair long and dark around his face. He'd been on the road, but now he'd come home to play this new song for me. Tears slid down his face as he sang. I almost felt you touching me just now. Wish I knew which way to turn and go. I feel so good, but then I feel so bad. Wonder what I ought to do. If I could only fly. If I could only fly, I'd bid this place goodbye to come and be with you. But I can hardly stand. Got nowhere to run. Another sinking sun, one more lonely night. Neither one of us could have predicted that 25 years later I'd be sitting in front of a computer in upstate New York, reading how, in the last months of his life, Blaze Foley still cried when he sang these words. Chapter 2. The Mill. I was in love with Deputy Dog before I ever met him. Our collision would take place in Whitesburg in May of 1975, but by then I was already pretty much a goner. I was 24 that spring. 3 years had passed since I graduated from the University of North Carolina with a Bachelor of Fine Arts in theater. College had been all about social development. My educational advance as a freshman was that I'd finally made out lying down. I'd matriculate to intercourse, senior year. After leaving the university, I had acted in dinner theater and summer stock, doing postgraduate work in complex sensual pleasures. Now it was April. A children's theater tour in North Carolina had just ended, and I was at my parents' home in Virginia, waiting for the next job or the next adventure, whichever came first. Deputy was 25 then. He'd landed in West Georgia the year before, singing for beers and tips in night spots in Carroll County. No one really knew where Deputy Dog had come from, only that Buzzard's Roost, a bluegrass band out of North Georgia, had given him the name. By now it was vestigial, left over from a time when he'd been heavy and wore a flat, broad hat like the buffoonish cartoon character from 50s TV. He wasn't fat any more. He was long and lean, 6'3" and handsome in a sharp-boned kind of way, and his name in some mouths around the county had been elevated to Deputy. Recently, Deputy had landed a choice gig at a new private bar in Whitesburg, the Banning Mill Dinner Club, set in an old yarn factory down on Snake Creek. I was in Virginia when Deputy Dog began performing there. At the end of April, I received a letter from Joe, a former college classmate, asking me to come down to Georgia to help start a theater at Banning Mill. In her letter, Joe described the artists already in residence, a Warlock jeweler, the hippie woman who made batiks, a gifted Jewish guitarist and his bartending wife, plus a traveling troubadour named Deputy. The name attracted me instantly, as if the individual letters radiated a rugged, romantic light. Something was going to happen to me with this man, though whether I knew it or decided it at that moment I couldn't really say, only that I was already fantasizing about Deputy when I wrote Joe back and said yes. Joe was a square-jawed Nordic beauty, versatile as a director and actress. After college, she and I had been roommates in a tidy Atlanta bungalow shared with 2 other actresses. Our house on 10th Street was next door to a menagerie of male hookers. Their pimp was a large, pale woman who sat in the grass in a see-through robe with her legs apart and no underwear on. An enticement I never really understood, given the sexual preference of her customers. Every once in a while, the old lady who lived in their cellar would come out and scream at the pimp. I never knew the reason for that, either. Sometimes the old lady would show up at our door, naked and asking for a peanut butter sandwich. Our household was tame by comparison. We were serious thespians looking for theater work in the area. In the fall of '74, the 4 of us had acted in a play in the basement of old, converted Banning Hill, 40 miles west of the city. The Killing of Sister George, by British playwright Frank Marcus, was directed by an ex-Atlanta actor living in a teepee on Snake Creek. We wondered how the play would be received in rural Georgia, considering it was about 4 savage English dykes. The role of Childy, George's mentally challenged girlfriend, required me to drink her bathwater and eat her cigar on stage. We'd not reckoned on the local hippie turnout. The play was an unqualified hit. 2 days before opening night, I got arrested for shoplifting at Kmart. I needed a few props for Childy. At the time, it seemed in character to steal them, no doubt taking method acting to an illegal madness. The security guard caught me with $4.85 worth of hot bobby pins, hairspray, and razor blades. He suggested I call my parents to bail me out, since at 24 I still looked young enough to play teenagers on stage. I refused, preferring incarceration. At the police station, I sobbed with humiliation before giving in giddily to the bazaar. In line to be fingerprinted, the woman beside me asked me what I'd done. Confessing to theft, I returned the question. "I stabbed my husband in the butt with a potato peeler," she replied, not without pride. I didn't know that was a crime. Brought into a room to be processed, a term usually reserved for cheese, I was photographed front and side, just like in the movies, and taken to be fingerprinted. A plain-clothed officer rolled my index finger over the ink. "Do you have a telephone?" he queried in a blues man's contralto. "'Cause I'd certainly like to see you again." "I'm a criminal," I insisted. Not that it mattered. He'd probably taken the job to meet girls. In the meantime, Joe had found a bondsman, a middle-aged guy with greasy hair and brown teeth, to cover my $500 bail. He offered me a lift home after my dawn release. "Thanks for the ride," I said as we pulled up to the house. "And the bail. I wasn't sure what one said to one's bondsman.
"No problem."
Turning off the engine, he flashed a mottled smile.
"Want to drop some acid?"
I demurred. It had been a long night. My crime spree had proved I was not cut out to be a bad girl. Except, as it happened, on stage at Banning Mill. The mill was a nouveau rustic artist colony bed and breakfast, the kind of cultural oxymoron only the 70s could produce. A wet club in a dry county, in that lay much of its appeal. For over a century, the 3-story brick and wood factory had sagged beside the thundering stream. Snake Creek slithered through the granite foothills of the Chattahoochee River, dropping 60 feet in 2 miles and picking up power galore. Churning out Confederate uniforms during the Civil War, the mill had been earmarked for destruction by Union General Sherman on his scorched-earth march across Georgia. Banning Mill had survived, so local lore still maintained, because the hell-bent Yankee couldn't find it. That aura of enchanted seclusion had endured into the 20th century. The creek's white rapids provided a dizzying backdrop that drowned out the rest of the world. When mill operations ended in 1971, a local banker's son recognized the mill's aesthetic and recreational appeal. McGuckin was a cherubic young man with soft red curls, braces on his teeth as a result of a bad auto accident, and an unmistakable gift for mismatched ornamentation. Nothing that decorated the mill's restaurant and parlors went with anything else. A razzmatazz of homespun and chi-chi that could bring on stigmatisms. People loved it. McGuckin's genius not only provided guests with wild country close at hand, they also got to rub shoulders with the wild, unwashed, hippie artisans at work and play. Resident artists lived on the top 2 floors. Weekenders could wander up to the large 3rd-story studio, where Ben the jeweler welded metal, if he wasn't out in the creek, bare-chested panning for gold. Or they could visit the boutiquist, stirring vats of richly colored wax for the sensuous tapestries of goddesses and landscapes she hung over the mill's crumbling walls. Musicians and actors occupied the smaller rooms on the 2nd floor. Joe's letter had explained that I, too, could live at the mill for free, so long as I was willing to create my own work and living spaces. A fair trade for a utopian ideal. Bring Banning Mill back to life, which included being civil to its guests, in exchange for a place to live, a small stipend, and the chance to make theater in a psychedelic wilderness. That May, I drove down from Virginia in the '65 Plymouth Belvedere my father had co-signed the loan for. Ethel was my first car, bought for $500, and already a relic of sorts. By the mid-'70s, push-button gears had gone out of favor, in response to housewives' complaints that they were breaking their nails on the buttons. North of Whitesburg, I turned off the highway onto the unpaved wagon road that led down to the dilapidated mill. Tall magnolias studded the leafy corridor with fragrant white blossoms, fringed brown by the late spring sun. Parking the car, I went in to find Joe. All I had with me were a few clothes, some stage knickknacks, and a slender black kitty named Meander. A vagabond for a number of years now, I'd learned to live lean. The theater was on the 2nd floor, where a metal door facing the water shut out the roar of the creek. The first production of the newly formed Banning Mill Ensemble would be a pair of one-acts performed in the round. Joe and I would act in The Curtain Raiser, The Master and the Apprentice by R. Ball, to be directed by Leo, the teepee dweller who had staged Sister George. The second, longer offering, The Bear by Anton Chekhov, would have lumbering Leo as the oafish suitor to my equally ludicrous widow, and Joe would direct. We had only 2 weeks to get both plays on their feet. The mill was still being restored, board by board, brick by brick. McGuckin had contracted Zonko Enterprises, a local carpentry outfit, to remodel the basement. Often we had to project our lines over the racket of the renovations, so we sometimes scheduled rehearsals in the late afternoons, once Zonko had knocked off for the day. Sometimes the crew would come by to watch us work. Since his arrival in Carroll County, Deputy Dog, as many still called him, had become fast friends with Zonko's foreman. Kentucky-born Joe had a wit that sizzled and an unrivaled devotion to dancing, despite the flat feet that had kept him out of the draft. He and Depp had bonded over a mutual love of songwriter John Prine, radical politics, and hardcore carousing. At night, Deputy Dog sang with a band in the downstairs bar, but during the day he moonlighted for Zonko. "I'm no Jesus, but I can pass," he remarked of his carpentry skills the afternoon we were, finally, formally introduced. Hillbilly cadences gave his bashful manner a comic lilt. His lean figure was slouched, sweaty and dusty, against the wall of the theater, where he and Zonko Joe were downing a cold six-pack. Joe chortled.
"Yeah, tell her about the time you painted Mrs. Lumpkin's curtains."
Deputy blushed.
"What I lack in sense, I make up for in zeal."
I could hardly meet his glance. From the beginning we would be shy with each other. And for me, since I'd already planned, if not our wedding, then at least our madcap elopement, there could be nothing casual in our encounters. He had fulfilled my expectations of Deputy. His eyes were luminously blue and unerringly direct. So what if he wasn't exactly the Sundance Kid? He had the requisite cowboy boots, mustache, and pierced ear. And besides all that, he was funny and sweet, with a curious, listing limp. But mostly there was the music. I'd never heard anyone sing the way he did, in a deep, resonant baritone, his heart laid open and bare. He performed familiar country standards, Hank Williams, Merle Travis, Chet Atkins, with a little John Prine and Chris Christopherson thrown in, and a dash of bluegrass and gospel. Nothing of his own yet. A young, raw performer, he had an unmistakable purity, a depth of feeling revealed by an unadorned delivery. Watching him perform, I sensed a vulnerability that drew me closer. During his break, we found it impossible to make small talk. In an early, halting conversation, he told me that his given name had been Michael David Fuller, and that Mike Fuller had been fact. It wasn't difficult to feel the lonely kid this svelte young man still carried on his skin. I was drawn to that fat boy, too. In high school, I'd been a dark-haired, flat-chested Jewish island in a sea of blonde, stacked wasps. I wasn't a wallflower, I was the wall. Gravitating toward the theater crowd, I'd felt at home with the self-proclaimed weirdos, the ones who were different and unafraid. Mike Fuller had found a measure of acceptance when he lost 150 pounds, only a year or so ago, Deputy Dog informed me now. In that way he felt brand new, a slim, blank page waiting to be written on. I was curious. How'd you lose all that weight? He smiled.
"I was on Thorazine."
The remark was thrown out so casually I didn't know how to respond. What did I know about Thorazine, except that it suggested madhouses and insanity? Perhaps he was trying to tell me something about the life he'd already lived. I wasn't sure and didn't pursue it. In time, I put it out of my mind. He never mentioned it again. It didn't matter. What mattered then was the musician before me. I wanted to be absorbed into that music. And I wanted to put my arms around the tender man it was coming from. Chapter 3. Hear My Song. Years later his music would bring him back. Though I distanced myself from his memory, my feet had never stopped responding to the melodies he taught me. Bluegrass, country, gospel, and swing. These were the rhythms I still claimed as my own. Yet all I had of Blaze's songs was a 45 RPM single of If I Could Only Fly, released in 1978. It had to be at least 20 years since I'd listened to it. I told myself that was because nobody had record players anymore. Then, in early October, a month before my trip back to Georgia, the filmmaker sent me 2 Blaze Foley tribute albums and his final performance, live at the Austin outhouse. My hands shook.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?